Hey everyone, it's Mary Mancusi, author of The Camelot Code, and we are about to get started with another episode of the Once and Future Writers Club.
Oh, the habits of my heart, I can't say no. It's ripping.
Alright, we're going to start out by doing a shout out to Sycamore Springs Elementary in Dripping Springs, Texas. I got to do a school visit with their 4th graders last week, and they were awesome guys. They asked amazing questions, really engaged, really great audience. So thank you so much for having me. It was really, really fun. All right, today we're going to talk about the most exciting thing when it comes to storytelling, setting. Oh, not the most exciting thing? Okay, fine. Yes, I get it. Setting gets kind of a bad rap. Like, it's not as exciting as creating characters or making up these amazing plots. But it can be really important to your story. So I think we need to rethink what setting is. In fact, I'm going to actually change the word because setting sounds like a boring word. And I think that's part of the problem. Like, oh, I have to come up with a setting doesn't sound as cool as, and drumroll please, I am building a world. Like from scratch, like my world. Like I get to make up all the rules in this world. Even if it's a lot like ours, it's still not ours. It's mine, and I get to control it. World building. That's what we're talking about here when we're talking about setting. I think I'm going to split this video into 2 parts. One is more of creating these realistic worlds, you know, kind of like our world, but different. It could still have magic, it could still have vampires, it could take place in the past or the future, but there's a basis of this is planet Earth, we are human, etc. Versus creating an entire fantasy world like in a Lord of the Rings type scenario where you're starting from scratch, you're making up rules and countries and political systems and religions and everything that has to go into that world is all your own creation. But first, we can't forget our geek thing of the day. And it is a pop figure of the Weeping Angel from Doctor Who. I don't know how many Doctor Who fans we have watching today, but I love Doctor Who. You can see I'm actually wearing a Doctor Who tank top there, and I love the Blink episode so much. This is one of my favorite episodes of all time. And the Weeping Angels, if you don't know, are these statues that they cover their eyes basically normally, and as long as you don't blink or look away, you are safe. But the second you do, suddenly it's like they go from here to here, and they're in your face, and then they kill you. Wah! It's really scary and awesome all at the same time. Okay, let's get back to world building. Yes! So the first thing you have to do when you start world building is to decide where your story takes place. We're assuming here, because we're doing the realistic stuff, that it's on planet Earth. So you need to pick like a town maybe that it's set in, or a city, or a farm, or whatever it is. Now, you can do this one of 2 ways. You can pick an actual realistic place, like New York City, Austin, Texas, San Diego, California. You can set your story in a real place, and that is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that. You can use pop culture references, you can use real brand names, and you can really solidly set your story in something real. If you decide to do this, a little piece of advice, make sure you are as accurate as possible. Because if you set your story, let's say in Austin, Texas, I live in Austin, Texas, and I read your story, I'm going to notice if something is off. Like if you suddenly have this subway system running underground in Austin, Texas, I'm gonna be like, yeah, we don't have that. I wish we did, but we don't. And it's going to take me out of the story, and I'm going to decide you don't know what you're talking about, which is going to mean you don't know what you're talking about in everything you do. It's just going to cross over. So make sure you are accurate. One way you can cheat a little if you can't go to the city that you want to go to, or you've been there a long time ago and you want to see what it's like now, is I would use Google Street View. Google Street View is awesome, right? You type in any address pretty much, and you can drop yourself down and you can literally walk the streets. You can look side to side, see the stores, see the houses. And I don't know about you, but I'm a really visual person. I have to see something to describe it. And so, just reading about a city doesn't give you that flavor. Now, walking down the streets does. Now, it's best to walk down the streets in real life, but if you can't do that, then you can do it virtually through Google Street View. I did this with my Blood Coven Vampire series. They went to Glastonbury, England, and I have never been to Glastonbury, England. So using Google Street View, I just plopped myself down and I walked around and I spent an afternoon there virtually. And that was how I was able to describe it in the book. And I think it really worked. So if this all sounds like kind of a hassle to you, like too much research, too much worrying about getting it right, I would create a fictionalized town. And that is totally just as legit as using a real town. And it gives you a lot more freedom to play with the world that you've built, because it's kind of like Austin, Texas, but it's not Austin, Texas, so you can give it an underground subway. Please do. We really need one. You see this a lot in comic books and like superhero movies where it's like Gotham or Metropolis. We all know that's supposed to be like New York City, but they are able to create their own town because they don't call it New York City and give it its own flavor and its own thing. So instead of the New York Times, we're talking about the Daily Planet. And so that really helps an author when they want to make their world unique, but also give it kind of a real world feel. But even if you do make up your own town, decide where that town is. We're not doing The Simpsons here where Springfield could be any town in the United States. That works for them. It's not going to make your story strong, though. You need to put your story somewhere in a state, in an area, in a rural area or a city. You need to decide where it is because it changes how people act in your story. For example, if you were in a small town in Texas, people are going to act very differently than in the big New York City. If someone were to rip off their clothes and streak down the street in a small town in Texas, it might be the biggest thing that happens to that town all day, and everyone is talking about it by the end of the day. Whereas if that same thing happened in the middle of New York City, a few people might turn their heads and roll their eyes, and that might be all that happens. Maybe it gets to be a viral video, who knows? But, it's not going to be like the big scandal that it is in a small town. So even if you make up your town, decide what kind of town it is, where it is, and how that affects your story. So now that we have our place, we need to decide when our story takes place. Now, obviously, you can have your story set in the past. You can have your story set in the present or the near present, because as you're writing it, by the time it got published, it could be a couple years later. Or you could have your story set in the future. So if you set your story in the past, you really have to do a lot of research of what that time period was like. What did people wear? What kind of houses did they live in? What food did they eat? What was a day of work for them? And that is all part of building your world. And again, if you get things wrong, just like if you set, an underground subway in Austin, Texas, your audience will know that, because the people reading that story are going to be people who love that time period, and they're going to call you out on it. I see that a lot in books where an author uses some kind of random word that wasn't invented till 5 years later, or references like an author who didn't write that book until 10 years later, and people freak out about that kind of thing. Now, one way to get around that is to have an alternate past, an alternate history, they call it. And that was kind of what I did with the Camelot Code. So everyone knows that King Arthur was probably a real guy. But in real life, he probably lived in the 5th century, way before like all the cool knights in shining armor and damsels in distress and castles and chivalry and all that good stuff that most people expect in a King Arthur story. That's more of the legend of King Arthur. So for my book, I wanted the legend to be the actual history, so then when they go back in time, they're changing history, right? And so I needed it to be real. So I created this alternate history where King Arthur really was a king in the 12th century who pulled the sword from the stone, exactly how the legends go, but it still had the trappings of like castles and chivalry and jousting and all that good stuff. And so it's kind of like an alternate history. And no one's going to go read my story and be like, oh no, this isn't accurate because Arthur was actually like a 5th century tribal lord. No, of course not, because they understand that it's an alternate history. So you could do something like that. Now, if you set your story in the present, we want to make sure it doesn't date too easily. Because remember, your audience is going to be reading the book from like a year to maybe 10 years down the road, and it's still supposed to feel like it's present day. So be careful of using very specific technology. Like, it's okay to say, I picked up my iPhone, because iPhones are going to be around for a long time, and they have been around for a long time. But if you said iPhone 7, you watch this video in a couple years, you read that book in a couple years, and you're going to be like, iPhone 7? That's super old school. Who would have an iPhone 7? That goes with slang, too. If you use very, very current slang, it's going to date your story immediately. When I wrote Boys That Bite, I used very, very current slang and current pop culture references, and I had to go back a couple times when the book was reprinted to change them out because they didn't make any sense anymore. I mean, I used things like MySpace, and everyone would be like, that was cool back then, but now like 10 years later, who uses MySpace? That's really weird. And so just be really careful when you use modern things that they aren't going to be gone by the time your book is published and read. And then if you set your story in the future, well, I guess anything goes. And you can do whatever you want because it's your world that you're making up, and who's to know what the future is going to bring. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about when it comes to world building today is placing your characters in this world. Who your characters are makes a difference in how they interact with your world. For example, if this character lived in their hometown and the setting is their hometown, they're going to act like very differently than if they are in a new town that they've never been in. Or if they go time travel back to medieval times, they're not going to know what to do when suddenly there's no indoor plumbing, right? Or there's no internet. Oh my gosh. They're going to freak out. Or someone who came from medieval times and comes to our world, they're going to be the fish out of water. They're not going to understand what a shower is. They're not going to understand what a video game is or what pizza is. And everything is going to be this shocking adventure to them. Same with if you put a fish out of water in a different town. So a girl that grew up in rural Texas is going to act very differently than a girl who grew up in New York City. And if you swap them, it can be a very interesting plot device where they go into another world that is not familiar to them, and how they interact with that world can be extremely interesting and make a very good story. So you have to decide, does your character belong in your world, or is she or he a visitor in your world? Another thing you have to decide is, does your story follow real life rules? So you could create a completely realistic story, whether past or present, where all the rules are the same as our real world. There is no magic, there are no ghosts, there are no vampires, whatever. And that is a totally legitimate way to do a story. Or you could add these other elements. So you have a setting like Austin, Texas, but in our Austin, Texas, there is a society of vampires living under the streets in that subway system or something. And sometimes the world is open. So everyone knows there are vampires now. It's an accepted part of society, and we are learning to deal with vampires being part of our society. Or it could be a closed society where we think everything in Austin, Texas is totally normal, but underneath the skin of the world, there's a secret vampire society that's actually controlling everything, and no one has any idea. So you can play with open or closed worlds in a realistic setting, and that's a really fun story to create. So as you can see, setting, I said the S word, I mean world building, can be really exciting and can be really fun to create because you get to play God. You are in control of your world, and you can make it whatever you want it to be, and that is a feeling of power. So don't skimp on setting. Really decide what your world is going to look like. What are the rules in your world? How your characters are going to act in your world. And I think you'll find you'll create a richer, more interesting, fascinating story that readers are going to just want to gobble up. So that's what I got for you today. I'll probably do another world building segment next or very soon where we talk about creating a world from scratch versus taking one that we already know and kind of making it our own. But in the meantime, I've got a worksheet for you where you can start building your world. It will give you some questions to answer and some things to consider when starting to create your world. And I highly recommend you go through it and start building this world that you're going to tell your story in and figuring out how your characters are going to fit into this world. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you listening to this episode, and I hope you have a new understanding of why setting is boring and world building is awesome. And before I go, one more word of advice. Whatever you do, don't blink.
Oh, the habits of my heart.